Welcome, Kathy and Patrick.
Happy New Year. Hello and welcome. Bienvenidos, friends of the Hispanic Society, to Las Tertulias de Arte Hispano. Thank you, as always, to our members who have joined us monthly since May of 2020, and welcome to all those who are joining us for the first time. We continue these conversations on the first Tuesday of each month at 6 p.m. If you are not a member yet, please do consider joining by going to our website, HispanicSociety.org, and search for membership under support. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Kathy Hall van den Elsen, who will be speaking on Luisa Roldan, a woman artist in early modern Spain. Kathy has studied Spanish art and literature at La Trobe University in Melbourne, Australia, completing her MA and PhD on the life and work of Luisa Roldan. She has taught, she has been International Program Director and Head of Academic Development at RMIT University School of Business. She's continued working with Spanish sculpture. She published in 2018 a monograph on Luisa Roldan with an extensive documentary corpus. And just last year, in 2021, her new book, Luisa Roldan, appeared for an English-speaking audience. She has also published essays, the annotated Oxford Bibliography on Luisa Roldan, and many book chapters. But it's not just Luisa Roldan. She continues working on Spanish sculpture, and she has a project also on women artists in early modern Spain. Tonight, however, she's going to talk to us about Luisa Roldan, and I'm going to turn the screen over to you here in a second. Is it playing there or no? There we are. Okay, there you are, Kathy.
Okay, thank you very much, Patrick, for that kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here. Well, here in a relative sense, on my kitchen table in Melbourne, Australia. But it's also nice to think that there might be people in the US who are turned on to listening to a little bit about Luisa Roldan. So she was born in Seville in 1652. And to give you a sense of her environment, she was born 3 years after a plague had devastated that city. And the neighbourhood in which she lived was particularly hard hit. One of her sister's godparents described the streets near her home as deserted. You could walk through the streets without finding a single person nor a house in which any family lived. So Luisa trained with her siblings in her father's workshop. She married a young sculptor at the age of 19. She spent the first 17 years after her marriage in Andalusia, having a family and working with her husband on predominantly life-size wooden figures. In the following 17 years, Luisa and her family were in Madrid, where she established herself in a different market, mostly working on small terracotta groups for the royal palace and for noble families. She did also make a small number of large wooden images during this time. So the Hispanic Society, and Patrick, we might have the first slide now, please. The Hispanic Society of America has the largest collection of Luisa's work outside Spain. The 5 terracotta pieces, we've got 3 very precious groups here, which are typical of the work she completed during her later Madrid period. Most would have been destined for small oratories or sitting rooms, and the tiny details that you can see there were designed to be scrutinized up close to aid in the prayers and meditation of their wealthy owners. Other groups like these can be found in private collections and museums in Spain, in the UK, and in the US. Besides the 2 groups on the top that feature the Virgin and the Christ child, we've got the Ecstasy of the Magdalene on the lower level of the slide, and that veers into different subject matter portraying the penitent woman who was reputed to have been carried up to heaven by angels 7 times a day when she went and lived the life of a hermit in Marseille. So the next slide is the other 2 works of owned by the Hispanic Society, and they've got an interesting history because they were cautiously attributed to the Spanish school and then in 1930 to maybe Pedro Roldan, but they weren't confidently identified as works by Luisa until the recent publication by a Sevillian scholar, Alfonso Pleguezuelo, of a reference in an inventory of 1731 to the heads of St. Paul and St. John the Baptist by Luisa Roldan. So Alfonso put this reference together with his knowledge of the Hispanic Society heads and added considerable weight to the attribution. Certainly a comparison with her works in wood, her large works in wood, will also add weight to the attribution. So throughout North America, there are more than 10 sculptures by Luisa, including some made of wood. She's more well known than when I started my research on her 40 years ago, but from an historiographical point of view, 40 years is a really short time, and there's still much to learn about her life, as well as unknown works waiting to be added to her known output of more than 80 extant sculptures. It's not uncommon to hear references to Luisa's remarkable talent and to her surprising ability to build a career despite the obstacles she faced as a woman in a man's world. I certainly agree with the first premise that her inventiveness and the quality of her work goes beyond many of the renowned Andalusian sculptors of her father's generation. The second common observation is that she shattered the gender stereotype by maintaining a career and a reputation when society would rather have seen her stay at home with her children, read devotional texts, and support her father first and her husband. I was and still am intrigued to know how the premise of the ideal wife that's promoted in essays and treatises applied to Luisa, and to ask the question, how significant a factor was her gender during the 35 years that she spent as a professional woman artist in the intensely religious Seville and the court setting of Madrid. I've been looking into this idea, first to establish what the rules were, to find evidence of what society tolerated in relation to gendered expectations, to identify any precedents, and whether any of her female peers had similar career paths. And I'd like to share some of my early observations, explorations with you. So we all know that for thousands of years, women's place in society has been a subject of public commentary. For centuries, the ideal female behaviour was described in terms not too different from Fray Luis de Leon's observation of 1583, that as it is for men to speak and to come into the light, so it is for women to confine themselves and cover up. The quiet, devoted homemaker was a much praised model of female behaviour. Until very recently, comments like these were cited as authoritative, but these views weren't actually readily applied across the class spectrum. Less well known are the essays of the female arbitristas, educated women from noble families who wrote about political and social matters. Among them was Luisa de Padilla, who advised young women, who encouraged young women, in fact, to dedicate themselves to virtuous and heroic works, such as those of many famous women who started great things. And around the same time, the writer Maria de Zayas wrote very popular short stories that included her objections about women's lack of opportunity, that she attributed to their lack of formal education. She says, I don't have the quote here, but she says something like, if women were encouraged to read books instead of being given an embroidery cushion, they would surpass men in their intellect, which is quite a thing to publish in a popular literature, I think. So the actual lived experience of working women in early modern Spain was barely visible in the writings of their male contemporaries. Although Spain's dominant national ideology privileged male authority through laws and religious tradition, popular writing and popular theatre suggests that a more fluid approach to dealing with life's challenges was sometimes adopted and accepted. So how is this debate reflected in the gendered expectations of early modern families? Nobles prepared their sons to take on the roles reflective of their actual or aspired social status. Their daughters learned to guard their honour, an important element in maintaining family reputation, and were encouraged to learn household management, embroidery, reading, and sometimes painting. In families where formal learning was valued, daughters sometimes had access to tutors and were as well educated as sons. Although their abilities might be recognised or praised, embarking on a career was not envisaged for noble women, at least not one in which they would be paid for their endeavours. The daughters of the working families learnt to support the family business as well as to prepare for the responsibility of establishing and maintaining a family's physical and moral well-being. The sons would expect to join their father's trade, either remaining as an oficial in the workshop or becoming a master on his death. Tradesmen's or artisans' daughters helped in the family business to the extent that they were needed or permitted, learning what they could of the family trade in the knowledge that their likely future would be dominated by marriage to a person within their community, bearing and raising children, and supporting workshop activities when they could. This all seems nicely tied up, nicely sewn up, a tidy arrangement in which boys followed dad and girls helped out before following mum into a life of service to the family. But what if a girl helped in the workshop only to develop a talent that exceeded her brother? The trajectories of three artist daughters born in southern Spain within a few years of each other provide an interesting insight into Luisa's career. So she had 5 sisters, all brought up in the same environment, at least 2 of whom trained in their father's workshop, that's the sculptor Pedro Roldan, alongside their brothers. Judging by just a few sculptures that we know her sisters were involved in, Luisa was by far the most talented, even though, as far as we know, her sisters were exposed to similar training, the same visual stimuli and the same socio-cultural expectations. The Roldan family lived in the same neighbourhood as the painter Juan de Valdés Leal. Their children were close to each other in age, and the 2 men sometimes shared commissions. Patrick, if we could go to the next slide, please. So these 2 works are by Luisa Valdés. She's the oldest daughter of Valdés Leal. She trained in her father's studio alongside her sister Maria and her younger brother Lucas. She was a talented painter and engraver who is known to have worked with her father. When she was 17, she produced etchings such as this on the left for a very large, ostentatious book that recorded Seville's celebration of the canonization of San Fernando. The work on the right is a sculpture by Pedro Roldan that Luisa Valdés polychromed, painted. in the same year. Or actually, she did that one, the sculpture, the polychromy in 1671 and the etching in 1672. So in that year, 1672, she married a local sculptor called Felipe Martinez. And you think, okay, yeah, that's fairly standard. You would expect that. So Felipe moved into her father's home. That was also fairly predictable. They had a daughter, and then troubles must have arisen, for soon after the birth of the daughter, the husband is no longer recorded as living with them, while she and her daughter remained in her father's house for the next 20 years. We've got records of a letter that she wrote to the Archbishop of Seville asking for a divorce, which appears to have been denied. So the next slide, Patrick, will have the slide, an image of St. Joseph holding the Christ child, observed by St. Francis of Assisi. This was done for a certificate of nobility. As far as we know, after this, which is 1676, her name as an independent painter and engraver vanishes, disappears from the public record, even though we know that she lived till early in the following century. So that's one, Luisa Valdez. Now we have another. We have Pedro de Mena's two daughters, Andrea and Claudia. They were known to be sculptors, and a third daughter, Juana, may also have been a sculptor. They were the daughters of a peer of Pedro Roldan. He served his apprenticeship alongside their father, Pedro de Mena. So if we go to the next slide, Patrick, we've got the Hispanic Society has got two precious tiny wooden sculptures of the Ese Homo and the Virgin of Sorrows, signed by Andrea de Mena. But besides these two and a couple of other sculptures, very little is known of the sisters' work after they joined the Cistercian convent of Santa Ana in Malaga. Their lives were fairly grim. The convent was very poor, had very few nuns, and was not blessed with wealthy donors. On a couple of occasions, Andrea's father, Pedro, was asked to bail them out financially. So the Mena girls probably had limited opportunities to develop their art practice after professing, and once again they vanish into a kind of oblivion. They may have still been active on providing work for their father, but we don't actually know. We have no evidence of that. So there's two or three really talented young women who follow the family trade, clearly do well in it, and then poof, they're gone. So let's now think about Luisa Roldan. She married a sculptor when she was 19, and instead of taking on the shadowy persona of paternal helper or supporter of her husband, her career seems to have blossomed pretty well immediately, unlike those of her peers whose output diminished in adulthood or was subsumed into a family workshop. As a woman of the artist community, Luisa was not trained to stay home with her books and her embroidery. Instead, exploring contemporary artistic currents through the study of drawings and prints and paintings and sculptures of her peers and the generations that preceded them. Often pregnant during the early years of her marriage, she must have spent time thinking about innovative designs for the Holy Week floats that processed through Seville streets in the weeks before Easter. Patrick, if we have the next slide, please. In 1677, she had the opportunity to put into practice the ideas that she had developed when she worked with her husband on the float commissioned by the Brotherhood of the Carreteria, the Three Needs of Mary. And then the next slide was a float done the following year, which was for the Brotherhood of the Exaltation of the Cross. And you can just see what a masterful piece of work this was for young people in their 20s still. So unlike the many women whose names were not celebrated and whose work was mostly absorbed into circles dominated by their fathers or their husbands, Luisa Roldan's name was acknowledged separately from the time she began to work for churches in Cadiz. We see phrases, we can have the next slide, please, Patrick. We see phrases appearing like Luisa Roldan, only sculptress of her time. Luisa Roldan is in Cadiz to work on figures of the patron saints. The Brotherhood of Solitude is grateful for the donation by Luis Antonio de los Arcos and Luisa Roldan. Documents found inside the figures, hollowed figures of San Servando and the Ese Homo here on the left, acknowledge the partnership that she enjoyed with her husband and clearly state both their names. This acknowledgement, I think, confirms a level of self-confidence which became increasingly apparent after she left Andalusia and established herself with her family in Madrid. Her husband appears less frequently in documents in Madrid, and his name is only associated with the execution of the St. Michael through his own reference in a letter to the king. Rather than wife of or daughter of, she was known as Luisa Roldan, escultora de cámara, Luisa Roldan, sculptor to the royal chamber. We have no evidence that she joined a group of like-minded artists in Madrid. Her gender probably restricted her access to life drawing activities or informal academies as it would have in Seville. So the next slide, please, Patrick. Despite this, we know that she produced work in Madrid for the court and other patrons for around 16 years. We know that Luis Antonio remained by her side in Madrid, applying for jobs at court, working occasionally as a valuer of sculpture in deceased estates, an agent for a family connected to a Flemish art dealer, advocating on Luisa's behalf by writing to Rome to offer the gift of a life-sized wooden sculpture, which was almost accepted until they were asked to pay the postage, and that got too much. No, not going to pay the postage. So that sculpture is now in a convent in outside Madrid. So just to finish up now, Luisa's career wasn't characterized by fireworks, by scandal, or by great eccentricities. She did not aggressively challenge the predominant gender stereotypes, but her work demonstrates that she did surpass the expectations of her sisters and her friends. She left testimony of a strong, independent, creative, talented woman, and her name has survived for centuries because of the innovation and quality of her work and her determination to produce it in her own name, achieving recognition in her own right rather than accepting a secondary role as someone's wife or someone's daughter. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Kathy. That's a very impressive summary of how many years of your scholarship to get us there so concisely and neatly. As you were talking, several questions came to me. One of them is, what drew you to Luisa in the first place? Because when you started, I'm sure she was known, but she didn't have, as you said, 40 years of historiography have helped. But what drew you to her?
The simple fact that she wasn't Velázquez and she wasn't Murillo, and they were the big guys, and I've never been interested other than tangentially in the big guys. Here was a woman And I knew that the image of St. Michael smiting the devil, which is the image you see on the left of the screen now, this is more than 2 meters tall. I knew that and thought, that is just amazing. How was that done? Who was she? What was she doing in the court, etc., etc. And then reading Mrs. Prosky's articles that were published in 3 articles that were published in the Connoisseur in 1964, I thought, oh my goodness, this is wonderful, but there's more to explore. So I grabbed my poor long-suffering husband and my 2 children and said, right, we're off on an adventure. And yes, the adventure continues.
Does this mean if you successfully establish Louisa as one of the big guns, you're going to give her up?
No, but it has been a joy to explore a life as far as has been possible.
Because, I mean, as I look at her work, one of the things is we've done the exhibition at the Hispanic Society, the Gilded Figures, is that the range of registers that she can express and the skill with which she does it is so breathtaking that, you know, I would have no qualms saying she is probably the greatest sculptor active in Spain circa 1700. And it's interesting that we've now reached the point where we can say that. And the thrust you made in this in your presentation, that her name, that she could sign it, I think that's something we don't stop and think about, particularly because you in the book you talk about this, but you didn't talk about it because we only allotted you 20 minutes and you had to be brief. But maybe you would want to talk now a little bit about the legal constraints that prevented a woman from actually entering into a contract in Seville, much less signing. I mean, it wasn't of her own choice.
Women weren't legal entities. Married women weren't legal entities. They needed their husband's permission to sign documents, or their father's permission to sign documents. So it's different for widows because they were able to just carry on with their husband's trade, if you like. But she needed all of the contracts that she worked on in Andalusia in the first 17 years of her career were signed by Luis Antonio. That being said, we've got enough documents, say in the Cadiz Cathedral Archive and the Cadiz City Council archives that refer to Luisa Roldan has come down to work on a particular sculpture, or the amazing Luisa Roldan is here, etc., etc. So we know that it's not drawing too long a bow to say, yes, he signed the contracts, but she was very clearly involved in those contracts.
To what extent would you, I mean, I know from talking with you that the mystery of the working partnership of her and her husband, I mean, you point out that at the end, he really does seem to exit the scene as an active sculptor when they're in Madrid, but it seems to be a gradual process that they start off both as active sculptors in Seville, and in Cadiz, she becomes the leading voice and he exits.
She was having babies with monotonous regularity, many of whom died. So by the time they went to Madrid, definitely there were only 2 surviving children. She had another child, then the middle girl died, so she ended up with the oldest boy and the youngest daughter were left, which would have freed her up quite a bit because she had, I think, 9 altogether, 9 births, which does which is likely to have knocked the stuffing out of her for at least a few years. And I would imagine that she would have been involved very much in the design of work. But if she was at home with babies, it's likely that that's as far as she could go for a period of time. But I think she never actually let go of her chisel.
Yeah. I wonder, I mean, the great mystery is what sort of style the husband had. I mean, normally the women are the forgotten figures in the workshop.
Yeah.
In this case, the husband seems to be the forgotten figure, which has a bit of poetic justice there. But there does seem to be an arc in quality that from the first works to by the time you come to Madrid, that there's a huge jump. I mean, the St. Michael is absolutely spectacular.
Yeah.
And some of the things in Seville that are attributed to her don't have the same quality. I mean, can we blame the husband for all the inferior works?
No, I think that's unfair. We simply don't have a single work that we know Luis Antonio was solely responsible for. So we need to, this might be a project for the next 40 years. We need to really map that out, and also map out, there are still ongoing conversations about where her father's influence began and ended. There are some uncanny resemblances between works attributed to her father and her work. So did she do them, or did he do the ones that are attributed to her? Who was active in his studio and when? I think all of that would help to flesh out these questions. And Luis Antonio has been much maligned for, or at least a couple of decades. But I just think we don't have the information with which to either praise or malign him, other than as a very obvious supporter of his wife, who did not discourage her from using her own name and was out there scrabbling, looking for work, making connections very actively.
Yeah. Well, you made a point to me once when we were talking that the will of Luis Antonio, and that his family in general seems to have been a tight-knit family, and his will suggests a genuine affection for her, which actually flies in the face of so many of the popular legends that have risen up about her.
But if you read Legend, Myth and Magic in the Image of the Artist, that Chris and Kurt's book that was reissued in, I think, about 1975, legends are very, very convenient things to invent, to back up a theory. And I have found no evidence that Luis Antonio was anything other than a good bloke. I'm very happy to find, a terribly damning document, but I haven't found one. His last will is pathetic in a positive connotation, that he describes his tobacco box that he wants to leave to one brother, and he's got a drinking glass with a blue bird painted on the side, and he leaves that to another brother. And he's got some other trinket that he wants to leave to his sister. They're really, really touching little, almost anecdotal things that don't point to a wicked, vicious, money-hungry, abusive man. I can't make that connection at all. But as I said, it's 40 years. 40 years is nothing. You know, in 40 years' time, heaven knows there's going to be a completely different Luisa Roldan persona because more evidence will have come to light.
Well, how do you think you see Luisa Roldan differently today than you did when you started?
Oh, well, I didn't know who she was. She was just this shadowy woman. And I looked up Palomino and thought, oh, yeah. And then I looked up Sean Bermudez and I thought, that's interesting. I wonder how he knows what she did when her father died and how he knows what her relationship with her brother was like, because he wasn't around and he wrote that 100 odd years after the event. And I've gradually discovered that it's actually safer to use them as touch points that represent the period in which they were written, not the period about which they were written.
Right, right.
So for me, I go back to the documents and the work. And if I can't find the document that says Luisa's mother brought her up with a very Christian outlook, just think, why is that even a thing? How do you know she brought her up with a Christian outlook? It's why say that? But Sean Bermudez said that in the early 1800s. So you have to kind of put that, oh, well, Sean Bermudez was creating an image of Luisa that he wanted us to relate to. But he also said that Luisa looked after her father after the death of her mother, when we know actually that her mother, Luisa, predeceased her own mother. So she couldn't have done that. So it's just a matter of unpacking and then repacking with the actual evidence that we have, not with supposition or with the idea of with an image already in our head. I started out with no image at all. And what I know now is the result of palpable evidence, touchable evidence, readable evidence.
How much readable evidence do you think have you been able to find for the other women? Because
evaporate.
The story. I mean, I love the story of how you found the with 15 minutes to go before closing time, all those documents.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the work I did in the early days, of course, was, you know, pre-internet, pre-everything. And some archives wouldn't let you photocopy documents. So you'd have to, that's why I wear very thick glasses, because I spent so long in very dark archives ruining my eyes transcribing untranscribable documents. And some of them were, well, in those days, things weren't catalogued particularly well. So instead of looking up, you know, R for Roldan or L for Luisa, you might look up, quote, a folder with documents about interesting people in the late 1600s. Oh, okay, I wonder what might be there. So Luis Antonio's will is another example. 1711, but it was actually filed in a book of wills from 1700. So I spent a number of months looking for a whole bunch of things, but looking in every notarial book from 1711, and I couldn't understand why I couldn't find Luis Antonio's will, and that's because it was in a book 11 years earlier. So it's just a really painstaking way. I found a reference to Madre Hieronima, who was the grateful recipient of a creche, 150 odd figure creche, who's Madre Hieronima. So many, many, many months later, I looked up so many Hieronymas, you know, my head was exploding with Hieronymas. And then I found the life of the saintly Madre Hieronima, who runs the convent in Cuenca. And I was then able to track her down. So then I tracked down the convent, which had been bombed in 1936. So then I had to track down someone who was alive in 1936 who might remember having seen the creche. And certainly, yes, he remembered it. It was wonderful, but it disappeared in 1936, and he wishes he could help me, and he wishes there was a photograph, but he doesn't have one. So it's just a matter of having this massive it's kind of like a family tree, only an exploded family tree that's a little bit crazy, with just lines going off everywhere, and then just trying to match up. Because people have subsequently said, how could you possibly have found that creche in Cuenca? And, well, it was, you know, a very, very, very long process. But because I had 100 other processes going on at the same time, this was just one of the many challenges that I was trying to address.
But along with that, though, was your discovery that her salary as escultora de cámara was paid late and not even complete. It was paltry to start with, and then on top of that, they pay badly. But you found, as part of all that, that she supplemented that with an equal, if not slightly more, from the Duke of Infantado.
Yes.
So that is a big part of the picture there too, that the myth that she died in absolute poverty, she just died rather hard up.
Yeah, so that series of documents that was signed by Luis Antonio actually in 1705, and there's another document in that folder that's 1709. That was in a folder in the National Historical Archive under something like sculptors, painters, and other artists. And so I got the folder and I found, oh, okay, so here's something about Luis Antonio. That'll be interesting. And then I opened it and read it, and it's things relating to Doña Luisa. And the Duque del Infantado is paying for some blue paint and some brown paint and some green paint for this list of sculptures done by Doña Luisa. So once again, that's just complete serendipity, but people often say it's just simple luck, but usually simple luck happens when you've been working really, really, really hard trying to find a needle in a haystack, or a needle in a few different haystacks, because the different archives, there's lots of different archives in Spain. And so the Royal Palace Archive in Madrid will have certain references to Luisa's payment, salary payment, and the Royal Archive in Simancas will have different documents about those same payments, dated either close to or a long way away from the original date. So you kind of have to have lots and lots of lists. And it's much easier now with things like Excel, because you can just match up dates. But back in the day, before all these wonderful technological advances happened, it was all notebooks.
Well,
Mm.
well, ultimately, it all has to be in your head anyway, whether it's in an Excel sheet or. But I wonder, as you talk, I mean, the Duke of Infantado makes sense because he's very important in the Spanish court, and it's part of Luisa's being a member of the royal court.
Yeah.
And it's her name that comes to the fore within that Madrid sojourn. The other two women you've pointed to, the daughter of Valdes Leal and the daughters of Pedro de Mena, they languish. Particularly, it would seem that Seville is a very inhospitable city to be a woman artist. If you're legally constrained
Mm.
and you're financially constrained in the case of Andrea de Mena,
Yeah.
you don't. Whereas it's hard, but at least it's slightly more fertile or favorable soil in Madrid.
Mm.
How does that factor with the other artists you've been looking at?
Well, I think Luisa's departure from her father's studio, the establishment of her persona as an independent woman, I think that gave her wings. I think it may have been tough in the beginning, but Luis Antonio's family was very supportive. Her father-in-law was the godfather to her first and her last child in Seville, which I think is quite telling. It wasn't just, a random Gilda from down the street. It was her father-in-law. And I think she developed a confidence very early on as Luisa Roldan, not as Pedro's daughter. Now, Pedro had two other daughters, one of whom was a polychromer and one of whom was a sculptor. They did quite competent work. They married not too far away from the time that Luisa married, but we've basically got one or two works from both of them 20 years later. So there's 20 years where they were daughters or wives, and they didn't have wings. They had kids and a home and family responsibilities. But Luisa got the development of her wings was supported by her husband, who could have behaved badly and, said, "You're back to the kitchen," but he didn't. And Andrea de Mena may have continued to produce work for her father in exchange for food for the convent. We don't know that. It's just the thought that I've got, because she was able to produce beautiful work. You can tell that by the two works in the Hispanic Society. But she didn't have wings as an independent woman. She was constrained by the institutional reality of living in a really poor, really strict convent, which was the Cistercian convent.
Well, as you speak, two further ideas occur to me. The first is Pedro Roldan doesn't even have a son who succeeds him at the same level. You have to wait. I mean, if you look at the Roldan family as a succession, the generation of his children, the child who stands out is Luisa. And if you go to the next generation, the grandchildren, the one who stands out is Pedro Duque Cornejo. Through one of the daughters. So that it's actually, if there is a legacy of Pedro Roldan stylistically, aesthetically, it's actually through the daughters. The second thing, looking at the Mena family, is that Pedro de Mena's children, I mean, the daughters enter the Cistercian house, and the one actually rises to become prioress, the youngest. But the children, the son, if I'm not mistaken, I believe they become Jesuits.
Yes, that's right.
And it seems that there may be, to some extent, they may have been pious, and they may all have felt a religious vocation. There may also have been, to some degree, a bit of social climbing, that it's a little more elevated to be to take holy orders than to be a manual artist.
Mm.
We don't have them around to interview them, to ask them, but well, it does cross one's mind when one sees, Pedro Roldan's whole family stays in the business. Pedro de Mena's family goes a different route.
But Pedro de Mena really styled himself as an intensely devout, intensely religiously ambitious man, I think. Whereas Pedro Roldan, the only comment we've got about his personality was by Palomino, who was a friend of Luisa. And I expect that either Luisa or Luis Antonio said he was a very solitary man who was much given to holding grudges. So I kind of think, so maybe he wasn't that easy to live with. Maybe he was just an old grump.
Yeah, well, he also found himself in trouble, no, because he wanted to polychrome the statues and take the contracts, and he hadn't passed the guild tests, which brings up another issue of
busy.
The guild tests, that it's bad enough if you're a sculptor and you're trying to polychrome the statue and taking a contract for that, you run into trouble. I can imagine that if as a woman you're a non-entity, legally speaking, you're at a double disadvantage, because for two reasons you can't sign the contract.
Yeah. Sorry, was there a question in that? I agree with you.
Well, all right, that was the question. Do you see this problem cropping up with the women you're looking at? Have you looked at women outside of Seville? Because that would be a...
Yes, I've looked at Maria Eugenia de Beer in Madrid. She also has done some beautiful engravings, but she kind of vanishes at the age of about, from memory, it was in her late 20s, I think. She married a sort of a minor courtier and then literally disappears. Ana Haylan in Granada, another sculptor, another engraver. She appears to work through with the support of her husband, who was a German, a silversmith actually. She had a pretty torrid time with her because her father died and she had to look after, she was guardian to her two sisters, both of whom ran away from home. And so she went, there's an account, a fabulous account by a Reverend Mother who was giving them refuge, and Ana Haylan came banging on the door and was shouting abuse, saying, "You let them out, I want to see them." And she invented illnesses and wrote them letters saying, "I need you to come and see me before I die." And both of them refused. And then
you can't make this stuff up.
And then her husband was sent as an emissary to try and get the girls out, and they wouldn't come either. So yes, her father died when she was very young, so she didn't have that same problem of trying to fit into his mold, but she was supported by the church hierarchy, so she did a lot of work for them. Book illustrations mostly. There's a few others as well.
Well, I understand we also have questions from the public who would want to ask. So let's fire away.
Yes, thank you both for that wonderful conversation. I have a question saying the two Roldana sculptures at the Metropolitan, are they part of a series?
Are you referring to the mystical marriage and the rest on the flight into Egypt?
I think they'll have to clarify maybe in their question in our live chat. But in the meantime, we can move on to the next one.
Okay. Although I can actually say that one of the things that Luisa was renowned for was the execution of a variety of small terracottas that usually measured around 40 to 50 centimetres in width and 40 to 50 centimetres in height, usually with a central Virgin and child, often with a saint kneeling beside them, or sometimes St. Joseph offering a fig or a pomegranate or whatever if it's a rest on the flight. So she kind of developed a market for that. It wasn't necessarily a series, but I think she was definitely known for her intimate images of the Virgin and Child with the saint. Now, the saints differ, and there were lots of them. We've got a letter that she wrote to Philip V in 1700 or 1701, in which she said, I've done 80 works in terracotta for the court. See the attached list. Except the attached list isn't attached. So we know that she did heaps of them. But as far as I know, I'm not sure if Patrick has a view, they weren't part of a series. They were just, it was a style of work for which she was known and that she must have found lucrative.
Yeah, I think that's the key word, because what happened is she comes to Madrid, as we've said in other contexts, that she comes to Madrid, she finds that her job isn't paying, and they have to make money somehow. So this is a way to it's actually very business savvy. She spots a market and she creates something and it sells.
Great. Our next question says, is the original art carried in religious processions?
Yes. So we look at them as art historians. So we can say, oh, look at the way she's done that ringlet, or look at the way she's done the amazing collarbone of some of the figures. But the owning brotherhoods, most of whom still own the works, see the image as a religious icon which is carried through the streets for the enjoyment and adoration of the civilian public. So whereas we might say, oh, but you're letting them out into the sunlight, or they might get wet or whatever, that's not how they're seen at all in Seville.
No, and actually the heritage conservation issues have reached a point where when it rains, they now can't do the processions, and there's always a great deal of angst as the Holy Week approaches and the forecast is consulted, and oh my God, is it going to rain, and are we going to have to cancel the processions? But I mean, this is not just though the statues. There's the question of, in Toledo, they have those fantastic tapestries based on Rubens' compositions that they take out for Corpus Christi, and centuries of hanging them out in the direct daylight have taken their toll.
Thanks. Our next question from the public is, did Roldan's life overlap Cervantes? And if so, is there any influence?
No.
Okay.
No, it doesn't overlap, and there's no influence that I have seen.
Yeah. And then I think our next and last question is, well, it starts with a comment saying, I've been trying to make a movie about La Roldana for a decade, so I'm excited to hear you discussing her work. Isn't the likeness of the devil, I'm assuming it's from your last slide, from the Saint Michael sculpture, Luisa's husband?
No.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
The idea that the sculpture must be a portrait of Louisa's husband stems from an old idea that Louisa's husband was no good and that she was secretly very repressed and hated her husband with a passion. And so when she came to do the St. Michael, she thought, I know, I'll make him the portrait of the devil. We have absolutely no evidence that that is the case. If you are lucky enough to go and see the work, which I believe is being moved to a museum in Madrid fairly soon from El Escorial, it's the devil's face is absolutely beautiful. It's beautifully executed. His body is just sublimely executed. His hands, the expression in his hands, oh, it's to die for. So it's very easy to say, oh, well, look, she must have hated her husband. So a woman couldn't be inventive enough just to do a humanized devil like all the other male sculptors were doing at the time. So she must have wanted to make a point that this was her husband. The evidence just isn't there.
I would say I agree with you completely. I'm glad you cleared the issue because, but I think there's a second consideration, which is if you start to think of the context in which the statue is made, the end for which she carves it, that it's a presentation piece to the king to help her along the process of securing the title of royal sculptress. She is not going to include something like that, which is subversive and problematic. It just goes against the issues of the context. And about her inventiveness, I would say, look at our Magdalene, the ecstasy of the Magdalene, because where that's for so many men an opportunity, the Magdalene in the desert is the chance for a nude in the landscape and a wonderful thing. She's actually gone to the trouble to show you a woman who is gaunt and ravaged by her penitence. It's an incredibly sensitive portrait, in some ways far more individualized and realistic than most Magdalenes you will find by men. So that you describe the devil in those terms is to be totally in keeping with my image of Luisa's ability to think the figures through in a very clear way that corresponds to the subject and what she's trying to depict. So,
I'll just very quickly add something. At the time, St. Michael was quite a big deal, particularly in Madrid. And there's lots of essays and poems written about St. Michael. And he was the savior of Spanish Catholicism, and he was the protector. And the devil in contemporary paintings as well was very real, very human. And I'm inclined to think that St. Michael was ridding Spain of its enemies, who were very human beings. And I think that I tend to think that that's a closer interpretation, that this devil isn't some ethereal being, a very ugly, wicked man. It was actually someone that you might be able to recognize, someone with very human features. And St. Michael's, in the poetry, it's, you know, save us from these wicked people. Yeah. So that's my interpretation of why the St. Michael is the devil is so human-like.
Well,
Great, thank you. I think we don't have any other questions from the public.
All right, well then I think wrap it up. Thank you, Kathy, and to all those watching for a wonderful tertulia tonight. If you would like to purchase Dr. Hall van den Elson's book, Luisa Roldan, please check the links in the description and use the code Women's Artist 20 for a 20% discount on the title. Customers in North America can order a copy from Getty Publications, and customers in the UK and the rest of the world can order from Lund Humphreys. We also encourage you to visit our current exhibition, Gilded Figures, Wood and Clay Made Flesh, Polychrome Sculpture at the Hispanic Society Museum and Library, which is open till January 9th, 2022, in our museum's East Building Gallery. And you can see some of the 5 figures by Luisa Roldan that we've talked about. More information is available on our website. Gracias y buenas noches.
Thank you, Patrick. We're done.